各位，在法国投资人路易斯的一次访谈中，当他被问到西方企业是否还能在中国竞争呢？他沉默了一下，只留下一句话：过去7年我们被超越了。这一句像是对整个西方世界的一记警钟。路易斯不是媒体的评论员，而是一位长期深耕亚洲市场的经济学家。他用的是投资者的语言，却点出了地缘政治的核心。西方的自信正在被中国的现实一点一点地击碎。他回忆自己在中国的30年，说那里已经从低价制造变成了高端输出，高铁、汽车、手机、金融科技，他认为这些都不是模仿，而是超越。我们都曾以为中国商品很便宜、很粗糙，并且非常低值，但现在，当你们坐上他们的高铁，用上他们的手机，再回头看一下西方的制造，你会发现差距已经在我们的身上。路易斯指出，问题不在于中国发展得太快，而是西方停滞得太久。以汽车为例，比亚迪售价$3500续航500公里，还配备自动驾驶，而同类型的特斯拉还要贵上4倍。你不能靠关税保护去阻止这一种现实。他警告说，那只会让你像40年代的巴西，保护本土的产业，却培养出平庸。过去7年的全球故事是，中国从世界工厂变成了世界对手。当西方企业还在谈论创新和自由市场的时候，他们的产品、资本效率和制造的速度，正被一群更年轻、更有执行力的中国企业重新定义。他甚至用一句话总结了这种反差，那就是当中国进入一个行业，利润就会消失。在 AI 领域更是如此。当西方的 AI 公司纷纷封闭生态，追逐利润的时候，中国的 AI 体系被迫开放，由成千上万家中小企业共同完善。结果是速度更快，成本更低。这不是巧合，而是一种新的秩序。未来10年最重要的宏观趋势，不是中美的脱钩，而是中国、印度、俄罗斯3子的经济整合。最廉价的资源，最低的资本成本，最庞大的劳动力，他称之将引发前所未有的繁荣。对西方而言，这一场繁荣可能意味着另外一种结局，那就是我们不再是规则的制定者，而只是市场的参与者。而这一转变已经发生了。真正的问题是，西方能否还愿意面对中国弯道超车的现实呢？还是说继续用关税以自身掩盖竞争的失败呢？让我们看一下视频。
Look, I think what's happened in the recent weeks, to me, it's so obvious. I've written it out, etc. The U.S.-China trade war is over. The U.S. has essentially said, okay, following the imposition of the rare earth thing, following the Geneva deal, they've backed down. Look at what's happened in the past few weeks. The past few weeks have been absolutely momentous. A month ago, you have the U.S. saying anybody who buys energy from Russia, we're going to punish. We're going to put in more tariffs. It's going to be terrible for them. So the U.S. sends out this message. 10 days later, who meet in Shanghai. Now, just that, by the way, is super important, because let's discuss for a second what's the big macro trend, the big mega trend of the future that will change the world. When I'm in the US, all people want to talk about is AI. Sure, it's exciting, etc. When I'm in Europe, all people want to talk about is how welfare states are about to collapse because, fiscal spending is out of control, etc. And so you got to buy gold and you got to buy Bitcoin, and, we're coming to the end of the welfare states. And that's perhaps a big macro trend. Sitting in Asia, if you take a step back, you think, okay, today we have Russia, the biggest producer of cheapest commodities in the world. You have China, the biggest provider of capital goods, the biggest provider of capital now to other emerging markets because they have the cheapest cost of capital in the world, and the biggest producer of consumer goods. And then you have India, which is the biggest provider of cheap labor. And now those three leaders are saying, we're going to put these three things together, mix it in a pot, and see what comes out as a stew. Cheapest commodities, cheapest capital goods, cheapest cost of capital, cheapest consumer goods, cheapest cost of labor. It's going to be a boom of epic proportion that comes out of this, a boom of absolutely epic proportion. Now, you take your 30 biggest market caps in the world. 24 out of the 30 are American companies. 2 out of the 30 are Chinese companies, Tencent and Alibaba. One of them is Korean, Samsung. One of them is Saudi Aramco. One of them is Japanese, Toyota. But essentially, so here are your 30. Now, how many of these 30s are going to participate in this boom? If the big macro trend of the next 10 years is the economic integration of China, India, and Russia, the answer is Alibaba is definitely a way to play it. Tencent is perhaps a way to play it. But in your top 30 market caps, there aren't a ton. So I think that the reason these stocks are ripping is that picture in Shanghai. And then I'll go one step further, really showing you that the US-China tensions are over. So the US, again, threatens everybody with sanctions if they deal with Russia. For the past 15 years, Putin has been lobbying China to build the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. And she chooses this very moment to announce to the world, you know what? The US just told me I shouldn't buy more energy from Russia. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build a pipeline to buy 3 times as much. It's almost like he said, suck on that. Excuse my French. But it's like, talk about defying a direct US order. Now you could say, again, it's hubris. You could say China's cruising for a bruising. Or it's just they feel pretty confident that things with the US are on an even keel, that the ability of the US to punish China is now limited. And so now all the gas that used to go to Europe is now going to go to China for a fraction of the price, priced in renminbi. And so now you know that for the next 30 years, China, a country that already produces twice as much electricity as the US, will now have the cheapest cost of energy in the world, which is a huge shift, and will pay for energy in its own currency. For the past 15 years, one of the big drivers of US growth was that the US had the cheapest cost of energy in the world, thanks to the shale revolution. This has just shifted. China is now the one that's going to have the cheapest cost of energy. So if you're a big believer in AI, if you think, forget this China, Russia, India economic integration, who cares, whatever, these guys are hicks. I don't care. If you think AI is where it's at, then the question becomes, do you think the constraint in AI is going to be access to computing power? Or do you think the constraint in AI is going to be access to cheap energy? Now, if you think constraint in AI is access to computing power, then you buy NVIDIA and you buy the US. If you think constraint in AI is going to be access to cheap energy, then what's happened in the past 3 weeks is that essentially China's already won that race. And I tend to believe that actually it is going to be constrained to cheap energy, and that getting access to cheap energy requires 10 years of investments, 15 years of investments. And China's now already ahead in that race because, again, they produce twice as much electricity as the US, and electricity in China is already much cheaper than the US. But they just took they essentially just got a call option. So you say you won on TikTok, which is, a detail of history, and in the whole scheme of things really doesn't matter all that much. But you do a deal on TikTok and the deal that's on the table is ByteDance doesn't give the algorithm that exists today. They create another algorithm. So it's like, here's essentially a shitty algorithm that you can put in this vehicle that will be owned by Oracle and by Andreessen, and that ByteDance keeps 20% of. And so you declare victory on TikTok, which is the thing that obviously is the interface that most Americans relate to. So it's a thing that Americans care about. You declare victory on TikTok and you move on. Just, it'll be like the victory in Iran. They came into Iran, drop a few bombs, declare victory, go home. And on the ground, nothing has changed. But it's, here we go. You declare victory and you move on, which is, by the way, much, much better than going through a 20-year war, whether economic or real war, etc. This is much better. You declare victory, you go on, and you get on with your lives. The point I'm making is not that China's getting the upper hand in this US-China trade war, etc. The point I'm making is that it's over. It's and that's one of the many reasons Chinese stocks are ripping. The war is over.
So Louis, to wrap up, even though we can talk for hours, to circle back on how we started this.
Options on the
Has
other.
the U.S. met its match?
How competitive
with
is
a lot
the
of
US going to be
certain
with these,
sectors
with this
that
China option?
we were
They
once
have
dominant
US
in,
products on one hand,
and the game is
now
changing.
Chinese
And
options on the
when you
other.
think about that
How
startup in
competitive is the US
Singapore,
going to be with these
who's
with this China
bootstrapping it,
option?
has a certain amount of money that they've raised, and they want to subscribe to an AI model. They need some servers and high-powered chips to power them. This China option, and they have U.S. products on one hand, and they now have Chinese options on the other. How competitive is the U.S. going to be with this China option?
I think first, it's actually different offerings. And this is where it's actually quite funny, is that the US, which is, an open society, very based on freedom, based on everything, the offers today out of the US, whether you look at your OpenAI or all the main offers are essentially closed-in systems. When China's systems are open-ended system, which is funny because it's like the opposite of what you would expect given the different societal backgrounds, but it reflects the resources of both. The U.S., their companies are so well funded, so rich, so much cash, they can't afford to be open, to be closed-ended, and China couldn't because it didn't have access to the high chips. It had to open its system like DeepSeek and let thousands of people offer solutions, etc. So the reality is, if you're a small company, you're probably going to go with whatever solution is cheaper, and China will most likely be offering the cheaper solutions. One of my go-to sayings is that when China enters a room, profits walk out. So China has entered the AI room. So if you think there's going to be tons of profits in AI, I think you're delusional. My 30 years of living in China have taught me that if you're competing with China, you've taken a wrong turn. Like, you need to take a deep look in the mirror and think about the choices you've made in your life. Because if you're competing with China, things are going to be very tough for you. So when it comes to AI, let's not kid ourselves. China is in the room. There will be no profits in that room. That's how it is.
Let's talk about some American brands that bet big on China, not just from a manufacturing standpoint, but also, this access to this rising middle class. How do you see the environment for an Apple, for a Tesla, for other consumer products? Because the Tesla thing sounds like an all-out disaster. The likelihood that they ever recapture the market share that they had a few years ago, given what you just said and what's becoming very clear about the quality of EVs, that seems like a tough one. And then, do you think Tesla is going to be selling, Optimus robots in China too? So it seems like Tesla's kind of done in China. So just help us think about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, going back to what I said, if you think the big macro trend is that integration of Russia, China, India, how many U.S. brands really participate in this? And yes, look, the reason Tesla, the reason Apple are no longer doing well in China, I don't think it's as much nationalist fervor or anti-American sentiment. That might play a little bit into it. It's just their products aren't as good. Like, to be perfectly honest, like a BYD car is now superior to a Tesla car, and it's not even close. It's like by a long shot, and they're much cheaper. You take the BYD Seagull, which is essentially like a Honda Civic type car, sort of hatchback. You get that 500 kilometer radius, and you get full self-drive with it, and that costs about $8,300 US all in. That's the BYD Seagull. Like, how does Tesla compete with that, right? A Tesla will be 4 times that price. And same with the iPhone. You look at the Huawei phones today, better cameras, better battery life, better everything. So, how do the Western companies compete? With a lot of difficulty, because again, the big story of the past 7 years, which I'll talk about till I'm blue in the face, but we used to identify Chinese products as being cheap, and they were. It was cheap products being made cheaply. This is, I think, the mindset we have to shift ourselves, and I encourage everybody to go to China today to see what's on offer: the trains, the cars, the phones, the fintech solutions. We've been leapfrogged. And I think deep down, we have this sort of superiority complex in the West where we're like, well, of course our products are better. But just like Japanese cars became better than American cars back in the late 70s, early 80s, this is happening, but not just on cars, on literally everything. So how do we compete? The only way we can compete is by doing better stuff, is by doing better products. Now, what are we deciding in the Western world, whether in Europe, whether in the United States? Essentially, we're saying, we can't compete with this. Let's put up tariff barriers. Let's in fact just block their products. Let's embrace protectionism. But down this path, this is not a way to get your products better. You go down this path, which is the path that Brazil went down, the path that Argentina went down. The whole thing about protectionism is essentially you're encouraging your domestic producers to remain mediocre. And so we're saying, look, we're going to try to keep what we have here at home. And these guys will continue getting better and better, and we'll just stay mediocre. The only way we can compete is by competing and by getting better. Now, when was the Tesla today is the same Tesla as it was 5 years ago, essentially. The BYD today is so different from a BYD 5 years ago. It's not even funny.
Yeah, I think we overplayed our cards this time around, and I think that became clear. I actually agree with you on Taiwan. I think China is much more interested in a bear hug.
Essentially, the deal would be, for the next 50 years, the current status quo prevails. So 50 years, current status quo prevails. Then in 50 years, we have 50 years of one country, two system like Hong Kong. So you keep your currency, your parliament, you can keep your army, you can keep your police. You're just, you do you, but we present you internationally. So you travel around, you lose your passport, you go to Chinese consulates. We represent you at the UN, etc. We can put military radars on. So that brings you to 100 years. And then in 100 years, we have a full merger. And by then, who knows what China looks like? Who knows? Like, everybody who makes the deal is dead, long gone. And so the reason this deal would be a tremendous deal for everyone involved is, first, it diffuses the tensions. Secondly, such a deal would mean that Taiwan wouldn't need to spend 3.5%-4% of GDP in essentially buying weapons from the US, which is protection payment. So you free up that money immediately. But most importantly, you reduce the uncertainty for all the businesses. So you unleash a wave of investment and a re-rating of the market. You look at NVIDIA today, it's a 4.5 trillion, 4.3 trillion market cap. TSMC is a 1.3, 1.4 trillion market cap. Now, NVIDIA can't live without TSMC. TSMC can live without NVIDIA. TSMC, I think, is actually the most valuable technology company in the world because they're definitely a step ahead of everybody else. And what they do, nobody else can do.